All right. Thank you all for joining in this radical collaboration session. I hope you're ready to do radical things. I'm not sure what they're going to be, but maybe we'll find out. Tafatwa and I will co-chair. I think just to set the frame, I think the idea behind these radical collaboration sessions was to approach these topics that are a little bit new to AgMIP, the traditional AgMIP hardcore crop modeling sense, and to focus on kind of new interdisciplinary sort of connections and new approaches to get at these topics. So it's similar to the working sessions, I would say, but more an emphasis on like kind of earlier stage concepts for AgMIP, like really just trying to see if we can put together some early concepts. Maybe we're not ready for a team yet, but maybe we can work towards that. Tafatwa, did you want to get open? Oh.
You mean link to this session?
Yeah, in Zoom. Oh. Hola.
Are you expecting more people in the Zoom?
No.
There we have one, I guess. I see Jose.
Jose. Can you hear us, Jose?
Hi, yes, I can hear you all.
Let's go.
Okay, great. Yeah, so before we get started, Tafatwa, did you want to say anything on the topic or on radical collaboration?
Thanks very much, Kevin, for the introduction. I think what we are hoping to do today, we'll be talking over the last couple of days around integration, really a lot of issues to talk about: climate change, biodiversity, landscapes, but we haven't, within the modeling community, we haven't really done much to address those areas directly within AgMIP particular. And some of these concepts, things that we deal with indirectly, the concepts of planetary boundaries. All of us, when we write, we always speak to aspects of the planetary boundaries in terms of establishing our rationale in justification why we want to be adopting systems approaches, why we need to be improving efficiencies, and all of those things. It's so that we don't breach any of those thresholds. But other than the rationale, we don't go far enough in terms of actually then making the linkages directly to planetary boundaries. What do they mean for us? How does the research that we do contribute towards the understanding and application of the thinking around planetary boundaries? We talk biodiversity in terms of promoting it. We're talking opportunity in crops. They are a subset of biodiversity. But we also don't talk much in terms of the trade-offs, in terms of biodiversity loss in agricultural systems and how that is actually worsening. I was reading a paper recently which was highlighting that even within systems where we are sustainably intensifying, there are significant trade-offs with biodiversity within those systems. So whilst the conceptualization has always been that if we sustainably intensify by not expanding, then we are preserving. But actually, we are losing within those systems. And that has ripple effects, especially for things such as pollinators and so on, beyond the field where we are sustainably intensifying. We usually focus on water quantity. I gave a presentation early today where we're talking about crop water productivity, and we've always thought about how much water but research is showing us that the greater risks to water are quality, not so much quantity, because of the impact that warmer temperatures are going to have on pathogen loads in water. And that has immediate implications for food safety and hygiene. So again, all of these things, they exist within the same landscape. So the same landscape where you are doing agriculture is the same landscape that is grasslands, that is forests, that is people living on it. And these ecosystem goods and services are constantly being exchanged across these different land uses and users. Hence, we're saying multifunctional landscapes. So how do we plan in a way that recognizes this multifunctionality, these users and uses, so that whatever we do in a particular setting is not undermining any other process or system, but rather is enhancing, as we called it in Nexus Gains Project, enhancing multiple gains across multiple scales. Yes. So that's essentially what we are thinking.
Great, thanks so much, Tafazo. That was excellent. So maybe to get the conversation started, as we like to do, is just having folks talk a little bit about existing activities in this area. And maybe if we can get a stock take in the room, who is working on issues related to biodiversity? And this is part of my new function as the communications person for AgMIP, is to see, can you give a succinct, compelling description of your work in, I don't know, let's say 30 seconds. Maybe maybe we'll start with you.
I'm Mary or Mo Oldenburger. I'm at the Institute of the Environment at University of Minnesota. So we're just starting a project. We work with a model called Foods Cubed that's a supply chain model, so we can trace back from particularly slaughterhouses or animal production facilities. We trace their feed sources back to counties across the US. So we're working in the continental US. And what we're starting to do, we're partnering with a couple of people at Cornell. Kathy Kling is one of them. Also getting county level information about, at this point, grassland bird species richness and abundance, and trying to see if there are, where the overlaps are there, and whether we can identify particularly high risk biodiversity zones. That's sort of we're doing it mostly as a proof of concept. So can we integrate biodiversity into the model that we're using, and does that do anything useful for them? But are hoping to in the future go a little further with that, with other indicators or something.
Who else? I know I went to your presentation today, so
yeah. So hi everyone, I'm Jack. I work at UCL in London, and so what I'm doing at the moment is kind of part of a team that does global scale modeling, and the aim of it is to try and understand how basically food systems and dietary choices affect kind of environmental impacts and health impacts on kind of a global scale. So my part of that kind of cog in that machine is looking at environmental and ecological impacts of food systems at a global level. So we're kind of trying to experiment with a few different methodologies at the moment and get a sense of how we can kind of work out these kind of non-linearities and feedbacks that might exist in food systems, kind of reflecting onto biodiversity and biodiversity reflecting back. So yeah, a lot of stuff to kind of try and puzzle out there, but it's a really interesting area. There's not much on the outside.
And if I could push a little more, so I think it's useful when people talk about which aspects of biodiversity or indicators that they're focused on. So you talked a little bit about species richness, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're looking kind of either at biodiversity, and there are so many different metrics to describe biodiversity, species richness, abundance, and then different kind of metrics of ecosystem function. So kind of trying to find out what the best way of expressing global biodiversity is, and often there isn't really a clear answer for that. But then also looking at kind of ecosystem services and how we can maybe drill down into ecosystem services and kind of fit them in a kind of a process-based way into these kind of ideas of food system models on a global level. So pollination, kind of carbon sequestration, water and soils, and also how they kind of bundle together, because a lot of these things affect each other. So, for example, if you think about pollination, it has an indirect component which contributes to every production of every plant. So you could conceivably say, okay, you could track the contribution of pollination to carbon sequestration, because without pollinators in a lot of parts of the world, plants would be able to grow at much decreased rates in a kind of an ecosystem scale. So all these things bundle together. So that's another thing which we want to look at. Yeah, a lot of different things like this.
And going around, so I'll go Frank and then
So I will prop Frank from Germany. I would probably point to a few activities that we do in the Institute, not necessarily me myself. What you've described at the global level, several of those things we do at the more regional landscape level, particularly looking at management activity effects on biodiversity indicators, birds, insects, selected species, weeds. We also look into crop biodiversity effects on selected indicators. We also follow that concept of ecosystem services. And I wonder why we have not considered that concept here in the sort of framing. Because for us, that concept is more prominently used than the planetary boundary concept, for which we often do not have a downscaled, disaggregated sort of reference at the landscape level. It's more global concept, at least to my understanding, and people are just busy with it to disaggregate it. So we use the ecosystem service concept. And we look at different ecosystem services, effects of management changes on these services. We have just started to appoint a person with modeling capabilities with respect to biodiversity, selected indicators. And as far as the ecosystem services are concerned, we are probably quite well equipped already with modeling capabilities, at least for selected ecosystem services. Heidi, you can complement.
They only on biodiversity or covering all three?
We are just having the round on biodiversity. That's what I understood.
I have nothing on biodiversity, but I think I
Yeah.
covered. Yeah. Yeah, so my unit has four research areas, and one is on the economics of biodiversity and natural resource governance. And so a bunch of years ago, we looked at alternative agriculture intensification strategies for Latin America, and in the trade-offs with various water use, but also species richness. I think we used some of those more global data sets for that. Then the colleague who leads the biodiversity work, she has done some work in China to look at habitat retention and biological control services. And then again, what are the economic benefits for farmers if they could actually retain a bit of habitat? So again, at the landscape scale, that this would actually be very cost effective. China, given that they overuse pesticides. So they would use less pesticides, they could retain some more species. Those species would actually take care of the efforts. It was a specific topic of study. So that was ecological modeling and economic, so household surveys. So to bring those two different strands of research together. And then they have done quite a bit of assessments in India, like the evaluation of the commons. So the commons are basically land pieces that the poorest women and rural areas rely on, the ones who don't have access to their own land, who don't have a land title. And so, so they looked first, what is the value of those areas, and then they also looked at to what extent changes in institutional management of those areas can protect biodiversity, address land degradation, things like that. So again, that's more institutional economics, and some biophysical model. So again, bringing this different things together. I think that's the kind of interest that we have, and generally it's more institutional collective action mechanisms, and to what extent they then make a difference for biodiversity or other ecosystem services. That's kind of our entry.
It's great. I think, were there some hands behind me to see? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I've been working on different states of South India, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. So the situations are totally different in different states. First one was aridity assessment. The soil was completely degraded in one part of the area. So it was like observed and take collection of observed data. So improving the soil based on the aridity indexes for the states, and heat index, heat wave problems are more in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh kind of area. So then the improvement of vulnerable areas are that helped us to help us in that assessment of the land area. So improving the soil was the major first criteria in that area. So soil biodiversity was the first criteria in that area. Then even forest soil quality index we developed for Tamil Nadu. That was for the Eastern Ghat. That Eastern Ghat area was not at all touched. So not only me, the entire team was involved in collecting data for the Eastern Ghat forest area, and then grid-wise we sampled and collected a huge data set we created. The paper is available in internet. Soil quality index is available. And for Kerala, that's humid climate prevails there. Other areas are having maybe 300 to 600 millimeters of rainfall, but Kerala has both 700 to 3000 millimeters of rainfall. So currently I work with the rice farmers in Kerala, and I promote as well like fertilizer use, reduction in the input use, especially with the natural or ecosystem based adaptations. In that I promote Azola. Then I wrote so many things, but not able to tell it now. Yeah, in the cropping with moonbeam on the edge crop, moonbeam, and then for pollinator issues, pollinator to attract the friendly pests. Biocontrol. Yeah, biocontrol measures like planting marigold, tulsi, all those things in between rice crop. And we have now solar based pest and pest traps available for rice, so we can reduce the pesticide use. Pesticide use is like uncontrollable, and we are also creating workshops to generate awareness among the farmers to reduce groundwater use. So people don't have any kind of awareness. They pump water like anything. They think that it is so freely available, and even in August is a rainy season. That time also they have to be pump water and waste water, I think, because overuse of water is also, I'm sure, so that also they create awareness among the farmers. And apart from that, seeds, the conservation of seeds. We had more than 3,000 varieties of rice. Right now, maybe we don't even have 200 to 300 varieties of rice in practice, but most of the farmers are following only 1 or 2 varieties of rice in our area. So the traditional rice varieties we wanted to revive. So my project is linked with some other partners in the next state who is doing conservation of only the traditional varieties, indigenous varieties of seeds, and they got some European Union project as well. So they are doing well. So we are collecting seeds from them to improve the livelihood of the farmers. So vegetable cultivation just after double cropping they are practicing right now. For it was 3 crops in a year. Right now it is only 2 crops in a year. Sometimes it is 1 crop in a year because rainfall in the month of June is always failing. Only after the onset there is always dry space, so they are not able to take up the first crop. So only the second crop they are taking. So during that time, just after the first crop, they're going for vegetable farming. With this traditional tomatoes, tomato tomatoes, and all those so many varieties of brinjal, okra, so many things are there. So all those seeds through through our project, we are buying from them and distributing to the farmers to preserve those seeds. It's beautiful. But the project close next year, there's no project.
Those are great. Thanks. Anybody working directly on kind of biodiversity type issues? Are there any other hands? Oh, over there. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm Felix. Hi everyone. I'm working at the University of Greece at the moment, and our project is rather focused on ecosystem services. That's why I was hesitating a little bit to raise my hand. So basically, we are evaluating or assessing the impact of land use and climate changes on several ecosystem services. But we also do have a biodiversity component. We rather have a citizen science approach. So we don't have these so very systematic lenses, but basically we are asking community members about their perspectives on how abundance of certain species has changed, and try to link it to the ecosystem services and see how this affects them. So it's maybe not a pure biodiversity project.
I mean, maybe we can just pause and reflect on Frank's point. I mean, is the concept of ecosystem services for this group seem like it actually kind of coheres a lot of these ideas better, more applied towards, we also think about that as applies towards agriculture, etc. Okay, that's useful. So maybe we can think about just reframing this collection of people working on these things. We can take that forward. How about water quality, quantity? Anybody have? Maybe see. Let's start with Heidi, maybe.
Water quality and quantity. Okay. It's not at all the core area, but in a few sets of activities, we're looking at understanding how possible in a German context adaptation to climate change, to kind of growing more crops in the autumn and winter, where there's less water demand, but nonetheless is still a water demand, how that impacts on what would normally be groundwater recharge, feeding into the Spree River, which is the main water supply of Berlin. So we really focus just on looking at how different crops and different crop rotations, the implications of growing different crops influence potential groundwater recharge. And in other activities, we're really looking at potential leaching, and we haven't yet made the link with a hydrology model to quantify that, but that is in one project.
So we did 2 grants, and the biodiversity one got funded and the water one didn't. So we're still trying to shop that around. But we are looking at similarly connecting a hydrological model to look at water quality and water use in the US. So that'll happen at some point when we get it, but it's something we're definitely interested in.
Which model?
Sorry, the Foods Cube model. It's the same model as,
So about 10 years ago, we conducted a global swamp model, which can look into nitrogen runoff into water bodies and NPK. So we looked at all 3. We connected it with the impact model. So we basically did 2050. We looked at alternative projections for 2050 and alternative fertilizer use efficiency. And then we just assessed what it will mean for Africa, Asia, globally in terms of pollution into water bodies. We actually looked at all sectors, also domestic, industry, and agriculture, but the only scientific publication we did was for agriculture. And now there's a lot of talk about, again, on the economic side and from the food policy side, there's a lot of talk about repurposing subsidies. And so a lot of talk is around repurposing fertilizer subsidies. So we might dig out that model and update it to CP6 because it's CP5, and maybe look at the water quality changes from repurposing fertilizer, maybe in a country where a lot of overuse, like India. So that we're currently considering to do that. But it's not a funded, so that's a problem. The repurposing stuff is funded to have negotiations with governments. But the governments obviously are not interested to repurpose or pollution problems. If they do it, it's because it costs far too much of the national budget, like into very highly unproductive. I mean, from a research perspective, extremely unproductive investments, basically eroding all of the other ag research capabilities that the country otherwise could have. So, but we can still look at basically an additional benefit from if they would.
That's great. Anybody else on water? Yeah.
So, I mean, a few years ago, I was doing this project that was looking at eco-hydrology, and there's some really there are such trade-offs there. Like there was a wetland site I was working at, where there were adjacent fields that were being heavily irrigated by groundwater. But this wetland was also dependent on the groundwater for basically its kind of recharge or its discharge. So like, you had these high irrigation rates surrounding fields, and this wetland was drying out, and there was big biodiversity loss and big kind of cumulative impacts on the ecosystem services that wetland provides. And I mean, this is a big thing in a lot of kind of dryland ecosystems or dryland environments where the ecosystems often are dependent on the groundwater, and then you have this basically trade-off where you need water for irrigation for the crops, but the groundwater dependent ecosystems also need them for kind of continuing to exist as an ecosystem. And obviously, the ecosystem provides services, so like there's this whole kind of complex web of things and trade-offs you have to try and navigate with that. So it's quite an interesting area to look at regarding kind of biodiversity and water quantity trade-offs with that.
Yeah.
Did you model that, or how did you sort of
So I put together I used remote Sentinel-2 data and basically took loads of snapshots over like 4 years of this wetland, and basically did a thresholding thing. So I set up an algorithm that kind of classified water and non-water. And you can basically see, as you kind of go through it, there are areas which are kind of wetted for longer because they have more time on this kind of water mode, non-water. A little bit of time, you can see which ones drying out more and which ones aren't. So,
Frank, I'm noticing a lot of similarities between our landscape scale modeling conversation and also this group. Seems like maybe we can just cast a wider, include people from this conversation as part of that and see where that conversation goes.
Yeah. That needs help. Yeah. Yeah.
But
maybe we could use the time of how to, because we did get that far in the other round,
Yeah.
how to move ahead.
Yeah.
What are the key challenges? Where's a common interest in that group of moving ahead? Those sort of questions.
Yeah, we can do that. Maybe we'll quickly do. I think you raised your hand on water, or no?
Yeah, exactly. Just very briefly, water is also the focus of our project, but it's more landscape scale, flood risk and soil water modeling with best. And the question is, can we do something meaningful with limited or almost no data? And this feeds then again into our participatory part of the project where we try to come up with develop community visions with the communities. So it's really ground truthing, modeling attempts, and also, combining it with citizen science and trying to see if it makes sense to the communities.
So some people who do invest modeling for various reasons, all over the place. And then we have a long history of hydroeconomic modeling, which then, because it's economists, they use GAMS to model water systems. That is mostly to look at benefit streams to different sectors and competition between hydroelectricity production and irrigation downstream upstream. Was what can also use for everything, and so we did that more for watershed protection assessments. It's like sheer. We had once looked at, so if you improve sustainable land management practices in the sheer, basically scale it up from a household survey to practices that have been applied. To what extent can you improve hydroelectricity production through reduced sediment into the shear, because unfortunately these guys still almost entirely rely on hydroelectricity. Good energy supply.
I'm just curious. I'm jumping into the planetary boundaries.
Sure, let's go.
We don't kill it quite yet.
Yeah, well, I have a planetary health hat, so I have a bias.
Bias.
I have a bias. I must
Planetary
declare
health.
my bias. But I think I heard us mentioned, maybe when we say planetary boundaries, I think of the concept, it becomes too big. But when we disaggregate it into the actual boundaries, I could locate, relevant work. And the work on biodiversity that most of us were talking about links to, the land use boundary, which is looking at land use change and those sort of dynamics. There's the freshwater use boundary, which, the case we're talking about, over irrigation and so forth, what you're talking about also in the Shire Valley, and, that links into the freshwater boundary. There's the climate change boundary itself. That is also there, and a lot of us are talking about climate change, so forth. So I guess part of it is maybe we don't talk about, boundaries, but how do we still link the work so that when we come into the global space as AgMIP and we want to align with global initiatives that are putting around these issues, how do we organize our work? Because since we are still doing work that is speaking to some of these boundaries, we might not be addressing all of them, but we are clearly addressing at least maybe 3 of them. Yes.
It may make sense to map what we understand or what is being understood from ecosystem services, some other landscape related indicators to the boundaries, in the sense that if you want to scale it up, because you have studies at different landscapes across the world, to the planetary boundary concept. Also look at climate change impact, you look at like trade pollution, or sort of indicators you can simulate a landscape level or assess at the landscape level and then scale that up. So there's quite some consistency already in that. But the boundary concept, the planetary boundary, if you would disaggregate that, it becomes, to me, it would become a landscape boundary concept. The boundary concept says don't cross it because then you are in trouble. And so if you translate that to a landscape concept, you would try to understand what you should cross in terms to destroy maybe a landscape ecosystem or a set of ecosystems. And so far, we're not sure how much that paradigm is really used in the landscape context. Maybe we've used the concept of resilience, but the boundary concept in a landscape context, I'm not so much aware of it. But I can see that we can scale up indicators to the global level. I can see that.
So one of the things we've been doing in the space of boundaries and indicators is trying to localize them. So in a lot of these processes that started off as global processes, there's now a lot of effort around localizing, because there's the understanding that action and impact is at a local level. So they need to make sense at a local level where people are making these decisions, which then aggregate into the space, global space. So I think your suggestion of, defining the boundaries at the landscape level, I think to me it would be a new frontier. Say, that could be something very exciting to explore.
I find that concept fascinating, and I wonder, well, on the one question is if you already have experience in translating the planetary boundaries into a more local or landscape level. But the thing that's really on my head is it would be very difficult to separate this, and we shouldn't, but maybe we don't have all the expertise from really issues around justice. Because if we considered like already who has used up their planetary boundaries, I mean, if we also consider things like around climate change, for example, or energy use, yeah, and I don't know, how would we separate like the fact of some parts of the world have already created so much damage to different planetary boundary aspects. When
At the local
downscaling.
level.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, I'm a Canadian person, we have no more space left on our landscapes and we really want it to be just the world. So how do you consider this like past exploitation, planetary boundaries by certain regions, and then downscaling?
So now we're going to the UNFCCC and dealing with some politics of who did what. But it's a very important topic. I think it fits into their conversations around issues of climate justice, where those issues are often talked about. And then there's a conversation linked to that around just transitions. That's something that is actively happening. Whilst the just transition concept was mostly associated with energy, it has now been broadened. So it's no longer energy specific. It's just looking at all sectors. You need a broad just transition. So I would think if we can locate it in the just transition, because that's something that is being actively discussed, there would be some resonance there. And some countries, I'll give the example of South Africa. It has recently enacted a climate change act, which specifically deals with the need for such just transition and defining South Africa's targets based on that concept to say, for South Africa, what would then make sense based on what historically contributed, what our aspirations are, and what is fair and just for our people. So I think there are spaces to locate these kind of conversations within the ongoing global discourse.
Yeah, I think part of the issue with downscaling planetary boundaries that we need to be aware of is that, for something like climate change, it is a global system. But for example, if the US depletes the High Plains aquifer, it doesn't really matter to India. So those boundaries are, I mean, it's because of trade, but like in terms of that's a landscape boundary that you could set according to like a watershed, and that tends to be the case for water related water use things, like the area where it's most useful to define. And some things are sort of very in between, with nitrogen, and two emissions are globally circulated. Nitrogen pollution in groundwater is much more local. So like there's sort of this, if we're trying to downscale all of them, there's a lot of different sort of factors to think about.
Well, I think there might be a difference between downscaling versus creating thresholds at the local level. So using that boundary idea, which I think Frank was getting at, applying it at the local level as opposed to downscaling.
Right, but like if you're going to apply it a global water use boundary, like you can't just like divide it by land mass or divide it by population. Like some of it's sort of linked to place. How do you come up with a way to, however you want to disaggregate it?
Right. So I think
it's not that this is a bad idea or anything.
Yeah, no, this is
It's
a great
conversation.
if I heard you correctly, summarizing Kevin, I thought he was talking about landscape level thresholds. framing the concept of boundaries, we should then be specific to that particular landscape. Say within this landscape, these are the thresholds that we should not exceed. So I think that, well, that's how I had in that context. Is to say, let's take a global concept, not disaggregate it or downscale it in the sense that we downscale like GCM data to regional scale, but just take the concept in terms of saying there are these thresholds that we should not, exceed, and coming to a local scale that people understand and engage with. Because part of the problem, I think, with the planetary boundaries, they are global. So it's very difficult to relate with them at a local landscape level where you're just trying to make decisions in a particular setting. But if we had those thresholds, let's not exceed in this direction, this has been exceeded, this has not been exceeded.
Sorry, I see, I saw that, but just waiting.
I just wanted you all to be aware, they're not here, Christoph and Herman are not here, but Peak published a report for our Conference of the Parties, specifically focused on the land use planetary boundary and its connections to the other boundaries. It includes an element that's related to let's call it land rights. It's not specifically the whole category of justice, but it's land rights. And it makes an attempt to link, at least verbally, the planetary boundaries concept with land degradation neutrality, which is the no net loss approach embraced by the parties, the convention, for approaching the land degradation problem. And that is an advantage for the discussion that you're having right now, because if in a no net loss approach, when you're looking at land, I mean, I won't explain all of it, but one aspect is that you have to this is the landscape part, you have to optimize what you do where, and you can't exhaust one ecosystem type to protect others, right? There's rules, and in any no net loss approach, there are rules that govern how it's done. But it means that you then can work, for example, at a watershed and optimize inside that watershed. But you can also, if you're interested, do it. You can then say, but what does that look like relative to the whole country, right? Are we contributing to no net loss or better, or are we doing the opposite, right? I don't know if this is the solution, but it might be worth taking a look at that document, which is not attempting to solve this problem. And then my last comment here is, this is a strong statement, and they're not here, so they're not here to defend themselves. But the land use boundary is the least published of all of them, and the underlying data is the least robust, right? It's only forest. It's only based on a forest in Africa, right? So there's a lot that could be done, including what you see here, to augment that at all the scales, right? To make it much more meaningful and relevant to all landscapes, all ecosystem types. Anyway, it's just I'm not trying to dictate, but just so you're aware of what has been done recently in this area.
It'd be great if you could share that.
Yeah, I did.
Send it to the AgMIP listserv. Alex just said everybody should send stuff.
I'm not on the list yet. I'm an outsider, I'm an interloper. I'll find a way to do it.
Yeah,
I'll split it in the WhatsApp to one of you, and then you can do it. Okay, so with that.
Yeah, perfect. But thanks very much. Yeah,
I think that spelling out of the boundaries at the landscape level should have a link to the ecosystem services. Because that concept there has been some thinking going into that concept, as it sort of tries to spell out what is needed in order to keep ecosystems, landscapes intact. And by doing so, you would at least know what sort of indicators values you reach for the different boundaries that you have. And you may then refine that and say, okay, that's a wanted level for a boundary type of indicator, and perhaps you give a little more space to reach a threshold which should not be reached. But that link, I would not develop parallel concepts at the landscape level when people get absolutely confused. There should be some link. And maybe that can be something coming out of this activity here that we made the first effort to see how that can integrate. Because it's complex enough, the ecosystem services.
Yeah.
And if you then introduce another concept at the landscape level, this is rather confusing than it will help. That's I'm afraid. Yeah.
Can I go quick before it ties into what you're saying about justice? So I'm just putting things together. So when we're talking about these multifunctional landscapes and optimizing across different uses of these resources, agriculture, etc., I think one way to guide that optimization approach could be we optimize such that we don't cross these boundaries, right? Like there's some sort of justice, perhaps value-based element in terms of how we optimize across these elements as well. I think there's values that are going to be imbued in any effort to, as you were saying in terms of, okay, how are we going to partition water in this watershed for these different purposes, energy, ecosystems, etc. So there's values, but if there's thresholds, it helps guide the optimization because we say we can't exceed this threshold while we're trying to figure out the right mix of resource distribution across the landscape. That makes sense?
It makes sense to me when it has a link to the ecosystem services.
Yeah.
So when you optimize, you want to keep the ecosystem services in view. Yeah. That's what we do at the moment. We try to find the best arrangement in a landscape setting in order to meet a range of ecosystem services. There's been decades of work going into this.
Yeah.
It may still not be the perfect thing, and I'm not defending it. I've not developed it, but it seems to work. And once you have reached a good balance of reaching these ecosystem services that maintain that ecosystem and landscape level, you may look at what are the values with regard to the boundary variables that are being used in that context, and that may give you a first proxy of a threshold. So as you cross that threshold, you will also be in imbalance with the ecosystem services. I would always try to see that link.
I think that's very easy. Yeah. Sorry, Heidi,
Yeah, maybe it goes in there. I kind of find the whole discussion fascinating, but I would have no idea how you would, because for me, the ecosystem services would be the easy part of it. How to bring in justice and fairness. I don't know how you would do that, but unless we can reflect that, then it's also interesting, like what you're doing at the local level. Like you said, that's the only place, it's a place change actually happens on the ground.
Maybe it's a chance now, once we think about that, to introduce this aspect as well.
Well, yeah. So there was a like a meta-analysis that came out in One Earth last year, where they basically had a look through a bunch of different bits of literature, and they came out with a figure of like 20% natural land in a system is kind of the minimum required for the provision of a bunch of different ecosystem services. And then there was also this other study that came out that was kind of tried to basically mechanistically simulate a bunch of ecosystems and force them through these degradation scenarios. And they found that basically after it goes through 80% degradation, which nicely mirrors with the 20% natural land needed, that a lot of these ecosystems kind of undergo this really non-linear kind of strange degradation patterns. So like if there was a number you wanted to start with to then investigate at a more local level, 20% natural land in the system might be somewhere to start at.
My comment for a warning that sometimes when you're trying to interpret concepts one to the other, you tend to negate some trade-offs that one should actually be monitoring. And we have seen in many instances that if someone spoke about sustainable intensification or sustainable approaches, how in some instances, yes, they do improve some of the outcomes that we're targeting, the security guidelines, but it also includes these services. For instance, when you try and redesign landscapes, you can introduce enemies into spaces that then enable some of the diversity that we have been aiming for. So one of the things that is important is what's with making these services and planetary boundaries is a proper valuation of trade-offs and also the disservices that arise due to these interventions.
Yes, thanks. I don't know if any of you, I can't see you, so if you ever see your hands, you just have to jump in.
To add to the ecosystem services, there's a word called geoethics. There are so many publications on geoethics. It also speaks about planetary boundaries and how to have just transitions. Just to add to this point, there's a word called geoethics that also talks in same just transitions and best use of the natural resources.
Gotcha. You've been here taking it all in. Do you have thoughts? No? Okay. Okay. Still processing. I know you have thoughts, you're lying. Okay, so maybe we can move into some of these questions to talk about kind of moving forward here. In terms of new partnerships, I might just start to say I think we could learn so much from the ecological modeling community. I mean, I feel like I'm looking at like a couple of people that speak the language and you, and it's like, thank you for teaching us, but like we need more, I think. People that come from like that hardcore ecological modeling world, I think that would be an interesting landscape ecology. Yeah, absolutely. Hydrology, etc. Any other reflections on the types of partnerships?
Integrated assessment, we have quite a bit here, but needs to be checked to which extent that complies to what we're discussing here.
Yeah.
There have been some sessions, but I wasn't able to attend. I'm not sure how far they go into biodiversity ecosystem service dimensions.
Yeah.
Or boundary. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on types of partnerships we need to form or different groups we need to engage to advance here?
Is there anybody working on storm surges? There's also causing all this storm surge. Sea level rise, maybe a long-term issue, but storm surges especially, and then aquaculture. Are you working on?
Yeah, we haven't really talked about coast ocean interfaces. Yeah.
Aquaculture and planetary boundaries. We are all of us are discussing that area. Aquaculture is a big topic process because it comes under culture.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, thanks.
I think
I don't know whether we have any models on aquaculture. I don't know. But we are happily using the land. The soil salinity is increasing.
Yeah.
There are so many plots because of plant scarcity. It's just like that in the coastal areas of Tamil Nadu, in our area. And I'm seeing that there will be taking this.
I think I suspect it's a big absence we had in this community right now.
Just a quick thought. In the previous session, we talked about that forestry is underrepresented in AgMIP. So that could be maybe another topic. What we are missing to get
intersection
links to food, to biodiversity, to improve water quality. I'm not sure in terms of modeling what's possible there in forestry. But there might be something.
Or in craft, people that have done so well. In craft, yeah.
Maybe a bit related question. So you guys are planning, it's like similarities with agroforestry modeling, the intercrop modeling. So maybe it could be a larger umbrella
Thoughts now?
Right.
We touched on it,
But, I mean, maybe it's again bringing new concepts. I don't know if this helps, but I think the land sharing transparent divide really helps. And I think so far, AgMIP speaking, a lot of the land sparing, we intensify crop production, spare land for biodiversity. But indeed, all these technology intercropping, agroforestry, they are the land sharing side of the biodiversity conservation. So I think they would be one option if we think about land sharing, divide, multifunctional landscape, but somehow they're intersection connected to.
Yeah, to analyze the various approaches. So you were saying with land sparing, you could really, sustainable intensification, you're actually really reducing diversity potentially overall because you're reducing so much.
Yeah.
In this intensified area.
Then the other thing that I just wanted to ask, when we think of partnerships, is what do we want to achieve that as a collective?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like what do we want to achieve?
Yeah.
We want to just do modeling and more number crunching. We want to develop products. We want to inform some frameworks at national, regional, global level. Like, what exactly do you want to do at the end of the day?
Right. What value does this add?
Yeah.
So Frank and I had. Oh, sorry. Yep.
Just want to say that you want to inform the UNCCD.
Ah, that was easy.
So we want to inform the UNCCD. Then the strategic framework would be the NAPS. So we want to inform the NAPS.
Sorry, what's the maps?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry.
National action plans.
Oh.
Yeah, so under the UNCCD, you've got NAPS. Under the UNCBD, you've got NBSAPs. Then under the UNFCCC, you've got NDCs. Those are the. Yeah.
I don't know much about the Biodiversity Convention, but what is, sorry, can you say again, what was the
National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans.
Yeah.
I should link to those two.
I wonder for people, I'm looking at you again, the unvolunteered representative for the biodiversity. In those groups, are they considering agriculture, ag interactions quite deeply as well already? Because people might have already considered a lot of what we're talking about, but from the other side.
I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of scope for going down these pathways. I think there is this kind of maybe disconnect where the ecological modelers are doing loads of amazing stuff and the agricultural modelers doing loads of amazing stuff. Maybe there doesn't need to be a little bit more kind of chatter because like at the end of the day, these are kind of the two dominating, land systems.
Right.
So like you do need to have these conversations in tandem.
So we're having a conversation tomorrow.
Yeah. Free and good.
Yes.
Yeah, I can add to that. CBD representing all conventions, but primarily CBD, agreed the global biodiversity framework, the Community Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Target 10 is sustainable agriculture. It's very ambitious. It's 100%. So all agriculture will be sustainable in all categories, land and sea. So yeah, they could use a lot from this group. We all know. So yeah, FAO, they don't use this terminology, but in SDGs, they call it the custodian of the indicators, and FAO is the custodian. They use another word in CBD, I don't know what it is, but they're responsible for the indicators. But that's the indicators. The contribution to do is where you all come in. That would be huge, and I think they would welcome that.
Yeah, so in all our conversations, I don't see the table. I mean, you spoke about participatory modeling efforts that you've done, through GIS and the fish exercise and things like that. But beyond that, there's us to go beyond people feeding into, but also us understanding why people do the things they do in this space. So a lot of the behavioral modeling, which I know people are afraid to have these conversations around that, but I think it is important. There are trends that can help in terms of determining threshold and biodiversity, like human behavior trends. So hopefully our conversation will gravitate towards that.
Or maybe start there and work backwards.
I mean, right now, I think the appetite to have such conversation is quite limited. That's why then, even if talk about it, it is not put on the table. People are aware of it, but then how to integrate this with the biophysical models and some of these other models, it's people have done it, but I guess maybe as this group, we just haven't really then wanted to step into that space as yet. I don't know.
Would it be a question of stepping into the space or partnering with people who are already doing it?
I mean, partnering suggests that you step on someone's toes, so. So for me, it's let's collaborate, but collaboration also means that we need to, negotiate, have a little bit, say, I need you, you need me, let's meet. But so far, it hasn't been, I need you, you need me. It's just been, oh, I think those guys are over there. I swear.
Yeah, for me, the planetary boundary layer is like confusing until it's defined, really. Because, I mean, my experience with the climate things, when you say you'll take the region, say for us, for SADC, it's the whole of the Southern African region, but then the countries can't even agree where the climate zones are. So how are we going to agree on some of these bigger kind of concepts? And the other one is about, I mean, there are now movements for transboundary conservation areas. So some of that is all now being legalized in some way. But I don't know, it feels like a really big mess to me. And whose boundary layers are the boundaries are you going to and
so we've got the trans-frontier conservation areas. So those are legal,
yes,
institutionalized, and we've got transboundary basins. Those are also legally binding landscapes. So let's say if you take a transboundary basin as your multifunctional landscape, it already has governance and all of those institutional arrangements in place. So it might mean that when we think of partnerships, maybe those are institutions that then we need to partner with, that come with those mandates and so forth. And we also then be able to operationalize these things within, like what you were talking about, say, the understanding of trade-offs and how decisions are made. So if we partner with, let's say, Nkomatu Suju, and they adopt that framework into their decision-making matrix, so it means when they are managing the resource and engaging they would now look at that to say, are we right now they just look at one indicator when they're managing the landscape, which should be just a freshwater indicator.
Just in how much longer does this session go? Okay, then I would just, maybe it's useful because it sounds like this discussion is super interesting but it's maybe still for us on a more conceptual level, this translating planetary boundaries to landscape level, whereas some of the other things we had discussed were perhaps more tangible? Should we, like, is there a need to also think of how we go forward, both with this, or maybe we just keep discussing, but I just wonder, are there some things that are already more the first two things on the list, and even maybe the idea of ecosystem services are perhaps something we already have some skill in, and we think, I just wonder if there are a little bit two different discussions. One more tangible, can we run to, and how do we go forward? And the other is, I think it needs more, my feeling is we don't arrive at the answer in 20 minutes on this, on downscaling the planetary boundaries concept. That's just me being.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you have initial thoughts about organizing more tangible? Sorry, you volunteered when you brought it up.
I'm really like, I'm energy balance modeling, so this is not, but I'm interested in the discussion. I was just trying to wonder if there were these two elements here, and
Yeah.
to see. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you something that Frank and I discussed a landscape scale modeling group, but it might be useful. This is more on the conceptual side, so it doesn't answer your question, but it's tangible in the sense that there's potentially scope, we think, for articulating the value add of this approach to decision makers, thinking more about end users and processes that Baron and Tafazo you were mentioning. And also providing some concepts that could be useful as well for decision makers, and could be some sort of perspective commentary type piece that we could collectively put together that at least helps us hone in on what are we talking about, where do we think it's useful, and to whom. I think that could be a useful exercise to start, because we're so early in this group. But separately,
So you're the perspective piece, and link to your communication and your box.
Exactly. That's what it's
writing wasn't part of that.
But to Kevin and what you're saying, I think the discussions are a percent of chaos and abstract and thinking. So I think the discussions are going well. It's a radical collaboration discussion. So some things are going to be abstract and conceptual, and requiring follow-up with the follow-up. And us raising those questions is going to probe us in terms of, as we go out of this meeting, what else do we need to think about? Some things are going to be well refined, because maybe there are very clear activities already happening there, and all it needs is certain actions to bring the pieces together, and we can then implement certain actions immediately. And I think both those two streams would be ideal to map at the end of the day. Maybe Kevin, when all is said and done, no, I'm not assigning it. I'm just saying when all is said and done. I'm happy to do it. I'm just saying when all is said and done, I see you're talking about. If you don't mind sharing them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can just go to the notes and pick out those things to clarify, trying to see what were the main actionable items and so forth. Then maybe come up with a short 1 or 2 pages that just summarize the conversations, and then people can agree whether that is accurate or it's not accurate.
That'd be great. Yeah, happy to work on it.
The perspective would be good. And that's something again that we can continue to think about, say, for those things that have big question marks at the end, it might be an opportunity for us to inform and guide the thinking in that space. Because if you're failing to figure it out, it's probably that many other people out there are failing to put a finger on it. And you don't necessarily have to come up with the answer. It could be a perspective that comes up with the questions that need to be answered, and just maps out the space conceptually. So these questions need to be answered definitively before we move into this next phase.
That's really nice.
I just wanted to add, I mean, all the examples that were given about the activities in work could also formulate like case studies that could relate to any one of these broader concepts, like the water issue in India, the slaughterhouse. I only picked up slaughterhouses. I'm sorry. One I think I was like, okay.
Shade sounds nicer.
My brain was not so what slaughterhouses.
We don't know what goes on Yeah, no.
Yeah, I think the case studies like then kind of like speak to the conceptual like framework to then say that this is how one would then yeah.
Kevin, is there still somebody online? Do you need to maybe just find out?
Yeah. Jose, are you still there?
Hi, yes, I'm still here. I've just been the fly on the wall, just listening in because so this has been a new topic to me, so I've just been enjoying the conversation.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks for being in this. I'm gonna email you as well as part of the group.
Okay, thank you.
I think to Heidi's point though, there is potentially a separate conversation about like linking biodiversity, biological control, these other things into ag modeling in a more I mean, there's this like we're trying to put together these new concepts to find this new space, but I don't know if you think there's also scope for talking about interacting with existing modeling systems in AgMIP in like a more you know.
I think that's really interesting, but I think after your response, if it's really this, I have this first 5 minutes, so maybe I was just not sure because it sounds so concrete with these first points, and then we get into this really super interesting and important discussion. But it's like you said, it's raising questions, and that's probably what it's meant to do.
Yeah.
So I was probably just doing it offline with my.
Just very much in line.
Yeah. I agree. All right, so I think we have potentially some good next steps here. So Fatwa, as I can share my notes with you. I think I'm going to combine. Some of you have already sent an email to as part of the landscape modeling group, but I think Frank and I were thinking we could try to bring these groups together. So much overlap. So we have another email list going around. So for those who weren't in the landscape modeling group, if you can add your name to this list and then create a bigger family.
How much of this can you eat?
Are you taking notes too?
Yeah.
I can't even read my own handwriting, so I'm
That's I'm asking how much of this can you eat? Yeah.
Oh, I can read this. The pictures help.
So many years.
Yeah, can you show this with me? Okay. Thank you. I'll try to incorporate. Right.
Okay.
So I think I assume we can close and have some extra time. Just make sure before you leave, if you haven't put your name on the list, you do so. And we'll keep the conversation going. So thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. And we nominate Finbayi to lead.
The last person nominated.
That's volunteering.
That's a strategy of removing yourself from the situation.
Well, I was telling Tony, it was his fault for not being in the room.
Yeah. We looked around, we're like, okay, Tony's not here. Put Tony down.
Onto my face.
Yeah.